Nathan Reed was a man who, from the outside, seemed to have everything one could desire. A successful businessman, well known in financial and social circles, with a beautiful home and a past full of achievements. But behind that facade was a man consumed by grief. Grace, his wife, had died tragically in a car accident nearly 3 decades ago. And she didn't leave alone, she was carrying the daughter they would never meet. Nathan didn't just lose his wife that day. He lost the family he never got to know, the dream of becoming a father, of watching his daughter grow, and of sharing with Grace the simple and happy moments of a family life. Time, though it passed quickly for others, seemed to have stopped for Nathan when Grace died. Although he continued working, building a successful career and keeping himself busy, he lived on autopilot. The house, once filled with laughter and plans, was now a cold sanctuary. The light that Grace had brought into his life had disappeared, leaving only silence and longing. Grief had become his most constant companion, something he had learned to live with but never overcome. That cold autumn afternoon, after a long day of meetings he barely paid attention to, Nathan decided to walk through the city streets. The trees were shedding their leaves, and the cold wind bit at his face, but he barely noticed the physical discomfort. His mind was far away, lost in memories of what could have been, of what life had so brutally and unexpectedly taken from him. With each step, Nathan found himself immersed in his own thoughts, recalling the happiest days with Grace, imagining what it would be like if his daughter were by his side now. Suddenly, something snapped him out of his reverie. As he turned the corner, he saw a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, holding an improvised sign. She wasn't begging, nor was she insisting on help. She simply held the sign with trembling hands, a look of resignation on her face. Emma, as he would later discover her name, seemed young, but time and hardship had left deep marks on her features. Her face was thin, with dark circles under her eyes, and her once beautiful hair was tangled and lifeless. Nathan paused for a moment, something about that scene made him hesitate. He wasn't one to get involved in such interactions, but the image of Emma gripped him in an unexpected way. She seemed as lost as he was. There was something in her eyes, a silent pain, that reflected the melancholy Nathan himself carried. That look, of someone forgotten by the world, made him wonder how different his life might have been. Without thinking much, Nathan took his wallet from his pocket. But this time, he didn't want to just throw some money to ease his conscience. He pulled out $300 in cash and, with a firm gesture, handed it to Emma. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she hesitated before taking the money. Thank you so much, sir," Emma murmured, her voice weak but full of gratitude. She seemed unable to believe what was happening, as if such a generous act was impossible to receive. Nathan tried to smile, but the gesture came out melancholy. Something in him still couldn't handle kindness well. He nodded and continued on his way. However, something in that brief encounter touched him deeply, in a way he didn't fully understand. As he walked, the image of Emma lingered in his mind. Who was this young woman? What was her story? Nathan found himself wondering what had brought her to that situation. Maybe she had made mistakes, or maybe, like him, she had lost everything due to circumstances beyond her control. He knew that life could be cruel to those who least deserved it. But no matter how much he tried to dismiss the idea, one question haunted him: what if she were his daughter? Nathan shook his head, as if trying to dispel the irrational thought. It was just a coincidence, nothing more. He knew nothing about Emma, but the thought that she might be the same age his daughter would be now, if she had survived, left him uneasy. A daughter he had never known but whom, somehow, he had always loved and longed for. When he arrived home, the usual silence greeted him. The large, empty house, with its impeccably arranged and lifeless furniture, felt colder than ever. He slowly climbed the stairs, his hands brushing the polished wooden banister as if in a solemn march. That night, as he prepared for bed, Nathan couldn't shake the image of Emma from his mind. He wondered about her life, about what had led her to seek help on the streets, and why she seemed so familiar to him. Was it just a projection of his own pain and grief? Or was there something more to it? As he lay in bed, Grace's face appeared in his thoughts. Grace, his sweet Grace. He wondered what she would think if she saw that young woman. Grace had always been generous, always believed in the goodness of others. She would have stopped to help Emma without hesitation. Nathan felt a pang of longing, but also a sudden urgency. He turned off the lights and tried to sleep, but something told him that the encounter had not been a coincidence. Something bigger was about to happen. The next morning, Nathan followed his almost automatic routine. The sun was faint, hidden behind gray clouds, and the cool autumn air seemed heavier than usual. He drove to the cemetery, as he did every week, to visit Grace's grave. Though these moments were painful, Nathan felt they were the only times he could still connect with his late wife. The simple act of laying flowers, of standing silently near her gravestone, brought him a strange kind of comfort. It was his way of keeping her memory alive, of reaffirming how much he still loved her. As he walked through the cemetery gates, the sound of gravel crunching under his feet seemed to echo more than usual. He carried a bouquet of white flowers, Grace's favorite, holding them tightly. As he approached the grave, his thoughts began to drift back to the previous day, to his encounter with Emma. Something about the young woman wouldn't leave him alone. He tried to dismiss the idea that there was more to the connection he felt, but the mystery surrounding her only grew. Laying the flowers on Grace's grave, Nathan felt a mixture of emotions. Longing, pain, and today, something more, restlessness. He stood there for a few minutes, in silence, as he always did. The whispers of the wind through the nearby trees seemed to be the only voices that kept him company. After a few moments of reflection, Nathan kissed his fingers and gently touched Grace's headstone, in a gesture of farewell. He slowly turned to leave. As he walked back to the cemetery gate, something made him stop. In the distance, he saw someone entering through the gates. It was Emma. She wore the same simple clothes from the day before, holding a small, worn bag. The way she walked, with her head down and her body bent under the weight of exhaustion, caught his attention even more. What was she doing there? Nathan watched for a few moments, trying to understand. What would a young homeless woman be doing in a cemetery? Intrigued, he waited until she got closer. When she was almost by his side, Nathan called out to her softly, trying not to scare her. "Emma?" Emma lifted her head, surprised to see him there. Her eyes widened for a brief second, but she quickly composed herself, offering a weak, timid smile. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice hesitant. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor did I expect to see you," Nathan replied, trying to sound casual. "Are you here to visit someone?" Emma looked at him, exhaustion evident on her face. But there was something deeper in that look, something Nathan couldn't quite decipher. She took a deep breath before responding. "My mother," she said, her voice softening as she spoke those words. "I never knew her, but I come here whenever I can." Nathan frowned, curiosity growing inside him. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said, genuinely touched by her revelation. Did she die when you were young?" Emma shook her head slowly, her gaze growing distant, as if reliving memories she never had the chance to create. "She died when I was born," she explained, her voice full of a silent sorrow. "I never had the chance to know her. I grew up hearing stories about her, but all I have of her is what people tell me. Still, I feel like she's always watching over me, somehow." Those words resonated deeply with Nathan. He knew what it was like to lose someone dear, but he couldn't imagine what it would be like to grow up never knowing his own mother. A heavy silence hung between them until Emma, perhaps sensing the weight of the conversation, tried to lighten the moment. "I always try to visit her," Emma continued, looking around the cemetery. "I don't know why. I guess it's the only thing I can do for her now." Nathan, absorbed by what she was saying, hesitated before continuing. "What was her name?" he asked, almost without thinking. Emma looked at him, her eyes darkening slightly before she responded. "Grace," she said, almost in a whisper. Nathan's heart stopped for a moment. Grace. It was the name of his wife, the woman he loved more than anything. He looked at Emma with new eyes, analyzing every detail of her face, every expression. There was something about the young woman that reminded him of Grace in a way he couldn't explain. Could it be a coincidence? Grace, he repeated, his voice barely audible. Emma nodded, not realizing the impact her words had on Nathan. Yes, Grace. I don't know much about her, but that's the name I was always told. Nathan tried to smile, but he felt his heart race and his mind swirl with confusion. He couldn't believe the coincidence, but something inside him began to burn with a new urgency. He wished her his condolences in a polite gesture and said goodbye with a slight nod. But as he walked away, without her noticing, he saw Emma slowly walk to his wife Grace Reed's grave. She knelt and, with a careful gesture, placed her hand on the cold stone, as if touching something sacred. Nathan's world froze for a moment. The young woman he had helped the day before was visiting his wife's grave? His mind began to fill with questions and assumptions. He felt the weight of something bigger forming around him. Could it be possible? He watched Emma from a distance, unable to process what was happening. Nathan left the cemetery, but an impossible truth was beginning to take shape in his mind. What if this young woman was his daughter? The daughter he thought he had lost along with Grace? That night was long for Nathan. The silence that had once been comforting in his home now felt unsettling. He tossed and turned in bed, the sheets wrinkled from so much movement, but sleep wouldn't come. In his mind, one question repeated incessantly: who is Emma? The image of her kneeling before Grace's grave continued to disturb him. The possibility that she might be his daughter, the daughter he believed he lost the same day he lost his wife, seemed absurd. Yet everything pointed in that direction. The age fit. Emma seemed to be the same age his daughter would have been if she had survived. And her mother's name was Grace. It was too cruel of a coincidence to be just that. Or was fate trying to tell him something? He stared at the ceiling, trying to rationalize his feelings. What if Emma really was his daughter? What if, somehow, she had survived the accident but had been taken away from him? Nathan felt his chest tighten with the thought. If that were true, he would have spent all these years believing he had lost not only Grace but also the daughter they had so eagerly awaited. How could he live with the knowledge that his daughter had been alive all this time, without him knowing? If it wasn't true, what would explain all these coincidences? He couldn't recall anything that would explain why his daughter might have been separated from him. But the more he thought about it, the more the similarities haunted him. Grace, the name, the age, the fact that Emma had never known her mother. It was as if fate were playing a cruel trick on him, or as if it were trying to correct a terrible wrong. Nathan got out of bed and walked to the window. Outside, the city slept, the streetlights faintly illuminating the horizon. He crossed his arms, gazing into the darkness with a growing sense of despair. The image of Grace appeared in his mind, smiling as she used to when they talked about the future. What would she say now? What would she do if she were in his place? She had always believed in signs, in coincidences that weren't mere coincidences. To Grace, the universe always had a way of setting things right, of bringing answers when least expected. Maybe, if she were here, she would say this was a sign that Emma was more than just a homeless young woman with the same name as her. Nathan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to form. He wanted so badly to believe. He wanted to believe that somehow there was an explanation for this, an explanation that would bring his daughter back to him. But at the same time, the fear of being wrong, of creating false hope, left him paralyzed. If he was wrong, the pain would be unbearable. He remembered the expression on Emma's face when she mentioned that her mother had died when she was born. The sadness in her eyes, the pain of a life of absence. How had she lived all these years without a mother figure, without knowing where she came from or who she really was? If she were his daughter, Nathan hadn't just lost moments with her, she had also been deprived of knowing her family, of growing up with love and security. He felt a sudden wave of guilt. If Emma was indeed his daughter, how could he have lived for so long without even trying to find her? He had accepted his daughter's death as an unquestionable fact, never once considering that something else might have happened. But now, everything seemed uncertain. And this uncertainty was eating him alive. That night, Nathan finally accepted that he needed answers. He needed to talk to Emma again. He needed to know more about her, her story, and where she came from. Even if the idea of her being his daughter seemed improbable, he couldn't let the possibility slip away. He wouldn't survive the doubt. But what scared him more wasn't the possibility that Emma might not be his daughter, but what he would do if she actually was. How would he deal with all the lost time? And how would she react to discovering that he was her father? Nathan felt a mix of anxiety and hope rising within him. He needed to prepare for whatever came next, but how does one prepare to reunite with a daughter they never knew? He took a deep breath and returned to bed. Tomorrow, he would seek out Emma. He couldn't let time or fear stop him from finding out the truth. Grace had always believed in signs. Perhaps the universe was giving him a second chance, an opportunity to finally find the family he thought he had lost forever. With that thought, Nathan finally closed his eyes, determined to follow the instinct that was guiding him. The truth was waiting to be discovered, and he would no longer run from it. The next morning, Nathan woke up determined. He knew he could no longer put off what his heart and mind were compelling him to do, find Emma and uncover the truth. The encounter at the cemetery, the coincidences, and her mother's name all pointed to something much bigger at play. It was as if fate, which had been so cruel to him, was now offering him a second chance to get his family back. Nathan drove back to the city center, heading for the same neighborhood where he had first found Emma. His heart was racing, and he felt a mixture of nerves and hope. He didn't know how he would handle the situation if he discovered that Emma was, in fact, his daughter. What would he say to her? How would she react? After some time searching, he found her again. Emma was sitting on the same bench in the park, holding her worn-out bag and staring into the distance with a distant look. She seemed so lonely, so disconnected from the movement of the people around her, that Nathan felt a pang in his chest. Could this young woman really be his daughter? He took a deep breath and approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Emma," he called out softly. She looked up, surprised to see him there again, but soon recognized him. A small smile appeared on her face, though it was still tinged with weariness. "Mr. Reed," she said, nodding. "What brings you here?" Nathan hesitated for a moment. How could he bring up the subject without sounding insane? How could he ask the questions that needed to be asked without scaring her off? But in the end, he decided that the truth was the only way forward. I was thinking about what you said yesterday, at the cemetery," he began, trying to find the right words. "About your mother. I wanted to know more about your story, if you don't mind." Emma looked at him with curiosity, but also with a hint of suspicion. It was rare for someone to want to hear her story, and the few times it had happened, the response had usually been one of indifference or pity. "There's not much to tell, really," she said, her voice low and resigned. "I grew up in orphanages and shelters. I never knew much about my mother. All they told me was that she died shortly after I was born. I don't have many details." Nathan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to ask the right questions, even if they were painful. "And her name was Grace, right?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Emma confirmed with a nod. "Yes. Grace. I never knew her last name. No one ever told me." The air around Nathan seemed to freeze for a moment. Grace. The name of his wife, the woman he had lost nearly 3 decades ago. He tried to contain the emotion rising within him, but his hands trembled slightly. "Emma, can I ask you a personal question?" he said, his voice slightly shaky. She looked at him with suspicion but nodded. "Sure. What is it?" Nathan took a deep breath before continuing. "Do you know what year your mother died?" Emma frowned, surprised by the question. "Yes, they told me it was 28 years ago." I'm 28. They said she died the day I was born." The words fell like a bomb on Nathan. 28 years. The same amount of time that had passed since the death of Grace and their unborn daughter. He felt a lump in his throat, and his entire body tensed. It was true. He didn't want to believe it, but at the same time, all the pieces were beginning to fit together. Nathan tried to speak, but his voice failed for a moment. He ran his hand over his face, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Grace, my wife's name was Grace," he said, almost in a whisper. She died 28 years ago. And she was pregnant with our daughter. I thought I lost her too." Emma was in shock, her eyes wide. She looked at Nathan as if she were seeing a ghost, the pieces beginning to fall into place in her mind as well. "Could it be?" "You're saying that," she began, but her voice faltered. She couldn't fully process the idea. Nathan, still shaken, looked at her with a mixture of hope and desperation. "I don't know how, Emma, but you might be my daughter," he said, his voice breaking. "The daughter I thought I had lost along with Grace." The two of them sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what was happening. The truth seemed so improbable, yet at the same time, all the evidence was right there in front of them. Emma didn't know what to say. For so long, she had felt alone in the world, without a family, without a connection to her past. And now, suddenly, this man she barely knew was telling her that he might be her father. The mixture of emotions left her reeling. I don't know what to think," she said, her voice trembling. It's too much to process." Nathan nodded, understanding the confusion she felt. He was feeling the same. "I understand," he said softly. "I'm confused too. But if there's a chance, any chance, that you're my daughter, I want to know. I want to do everything I can to find out the truth." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she began to cry. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to contain the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. "I've waited so long to know where I come from," she said, through her sobs. "And now this is happening. I don't know if I'm ready for it." Nathan, heartbroken to see her pain, moved closer and, hesitantly, embraced her gently. He didn't know what else to do. All he wanted was to comfort her, to help her through this confusing moment. "You don't have to be ready right now," he said, his voice low and full of emotion. "We'll figure this out together. I'm here. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to help you." After a long moment, Emma finally returned the hug, letting her tears fall freely. It was as if all the weight of her life, all the abandonment and pain she had felt, was being released in that moment. When the hug ended, Emma wiped away her tears and looked at Nathan, still in shock. I have a son," she said, her voice still trembling. "Sam. He's at the shelter now." Nathan blinked, surprised. "A grandson." He had a grandson. "A son," he repeated, emotional. I have a grandson." Emma nodded, still processing everything. "Yes. Sam. He's 5 years old. I didn't know how to tell you before. I didn't know what to do." Nathan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Not only had he found his daughter, but he also had a grandson. The family he thought he had lost forever was right there in front of him. "We need to get him," Emma said suddenly. I can't leave Sam waiting. He's all I have." Nathan smiled, his tears now tears of joy. "Let's go get Sam," he said, his voice trembling. "And then, let's go home." Nathan's car sped through the streets, but inside, time seemed to move slower. Emotions were still running high, both for him and for Emma. The journey to the shelter where Sam was felt endless, and Nathan's heart oscillated between joy and nerves. He was going to meet his grandson. The idea that his family, which he had believed lost forever, was now growing filled his chest with a happiness he could barely contain. But along with that happiness came worry. How could he make up for all the years they had spent apart? How could he be the father and grandfather that Emma and Sam needed? Emma, sitting beside him, was tense, nervously fidgeting with her fingers. She was still processing everything that had happened. The revelation that Nathan might be her father, something she had never expected to discover, left her anxious. At the same time, she felt relieved. The idea of finally having a family, something that had always been missing in her life, was both exciting and terrifying. But the thought that worried her most was Sam. He had been her everything for the past few years, the reason she kept fighting even when everything seemed impossible. "Sam is going to like you," she said suddenly, breaking the silence in the car. Her voice was low, but there was a hint of hope in it. Nathan looked at her quickly, surprised by the statement, but smiled softly. "I hope so," he replied, trying to hide the anxiety growing in his chest. "I can't wait to meet him." Emma took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She still didn't know how to explain all this to Sam, how to tell him that the man they were about to meet was actually his grandfather. She knew Sam was still too young to fully understand, but she also knew he had always longed for a male figure, something she, no matter how hard she tried, could never fulfill. Finally, they arrived at the shelter. It was an old building, simple but well kept, with children playing in the small park in front. Emma got out of the car first, and Nathan followed. He watched as she walked to the door of the building, her body tense but determined. This was the moment. Inside the shelter, the fluorescent lights and the sounds of children's voices filled the air. Emma approached a staff member, who knew her well, and asked for Sam. The woman smiled and motioned for her to wait. A few minutes later, Sam appeared in the hallway. He was a small boy with tousled brown hair and bright, curious eyes. Sam ran to Emma with a smile on his face, and she knelt down to hug him tightly. The embrace seemed long, as if Emma were trying to convey everything she felt in that moment to her son. When they finally let go, Emma looked at Nathan, a little hesitant, but gave him a small nod. "Sam, I want you to meet someone," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "This is Nathan. He's your grandfather." Sam looked at Nathan, his eyes wide with the novelty. He didn't know what to think, but his expression showed curiosity. For him, the idea of having a grandfather was as distant as anything else he had yet to understand in life. Nathan, who had been holding himself back until that moment, knelt down to be at Sam's eye level. He looked directly into the boy's eyes, feeling an emotion he couldn't fully explain. His grandson. His daughter's son. The continuation of his family. "Hi, Sam," Nathan said, his voice a little shaky with emotion. "I've heard so many good things about you. I'm very happy to finally meet you." Sam was silent for a few seconds, studying Nathan with the curious gaze of a child. After a moment, he slowly stepped forward and, to everyone's surprise, gave Nathan a hesitant hug. Nathan felt his heart nearly burst with emotion. He returned Sam's hug carefully, as if he were holding something extremely precious and fragile. That small gesture from the boy was enough to make Nathan feel that, despite all the lost years, he finally had a chance to reconnect his family. The pain and grief that had accompanied him for so many years began to dissolve in that moment. Emma watched the scene with tears in her eyes. Her son was meeting the grandfather she never thought he would have. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt that life could be different, that she was no longer alone. After the emotional reunion, they left the shelter together, with Sam holding Emma's hand and Nathan beside them. For the first time in decades, Nathan felt alive in a way he had forgotten was possible. He was no longer alone. He had a daughter and a grandson. He had a new family. When they arrived at Nathan's home, Emma and Sam were introduced to the life they could have had. The large house, which had once felt cold and empty, now had the sound of voices, of laughter, of life. And though he knew the road to full recovery would be long, Nathan was determined to do whatever it took to care for Emma and Sam. They were his new reason to live. In the days that followed, Emma and Nathan began making arrangements for her and Sam to move permanently into his home. The process was quick, but full of emotions. Sam adapted to his new life surprisingly well, and Nathan's presence brought a stability he had never known before. As they prepared for the future, Nathan also made an important decision, to take a DNA test to confirm paternity. He and Emma discussed it openly, and both agreed it was the best way to bring the complete truth to light. Although deep down, Nathan already knew what the results would show. Emma was his daughter. he didn't need a piece of paper to confirm what his heart already knew. The days that followed that reunion were unlike anything Nathan could have imagined. The house, which had been silent and empty for years, was now full of life. Emma and Sam had moved into Nathan's home, and with them, they brought a new energy, a sense of family that he never expected to experience again. Sam, with his childlike energy, filled the space with laughter and curiosity. He explored every corner of the house, fascinated by what seemed to him to be a true palace. Nathan, for his part, was enchanted to see him grow and adapt so quickly. The boy brought a genuine joy, something Nathan hadn't seen in his life for many years. Being a grandfather was something he had never planned, but now it was a role he embraced wholeheartedly. Emma, too, was beginning to find her place. She was still processing the enormous change her life had taken, but Nathan's presence and the support he offered her and Sam brought a peace she had never known. Finally, she had a family. A family she had always wanted, but believed was beyond her reach. She had fought so hard to survive, and now, for the first time, she felt she could live with dignity and hope. As they continued adjusting to the new dynamic, Nathan remained firm in his decision to take the DNA test. Although there was already an undeniable bond between him and Emma, there was a part of him that needed that final confirmation. For him, it was more than a matter of science, it was closure. A validation that, after all the suffering, he had found his daughter, the one he thought he had lost forever. When the day of the DNA test results arrived, Emma was nervous. It wasn't that she doubted the bond between them, on the contrary, the emotional connection between her and Nathan was undeniable. But the test was the only way to bring the full truth to light, leaving no room for doubt. When the envelope finally arrived, both sat in the living room, side by side, with Sam playing on the floor nearby. Nathan opened the envelope with trembling hands, and as he read the result, he felt a huge weight lifted off his shoulders. It was true. Emma was his daughter. The numbers, the results, were there, confirming what he already knew in his heart. He let out a sigh of relief and emotion, while Emma watched with a look of mixed anxiety and hope. "It's true," Nathan said, smiling as he looked at Emma. "You're my daughter." Emma, who had already felt this in her heart, let tears stream down her face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief, of a lifetime of uncertainty finally coming to an end. She threw herself into Nathan's arms, and the two of them stayed there, embracing, while Sam, not fully understanding the depth of the moment, watched them with curiosity. Nathan held Emma tightly, as if trying to make up for the lost years, as if that hug could recover the time they would never live together. But they had the future. They had Sam. And finally, they had the chance to be a family. With the DNA test result, Nathan felt more motivated than ever to help Emma restart her life. He knew that, because of everything she had gone through, Emma had sacrificed many of her own dreams to ensure Sam had what he needed. But now, with him by her side, she could finally think about herself, about her future. The following week, Nathan encouraged her to go back to school. Emma had always wanted to finish school and, maybe one day, go to college, but the hardships of life had never given her that chance. With Nathan's help, she began enrolling in GED programs to complete her formal education. The prospect of starting over, of finally having control over her future, was both exciting and terrifying. But with Nathan by her side, she knew she was no longer alone. Life, which had so often been unfair and cruel to her, was now giving her a new opportunity. And she was determined to make the most of it, not just for herself, but for Sam, and for Nathan, who was now the anchor that kept her steady. The sun shone softly over the campus of the small community college, where families and friends gathered to celebrate a special occasion. The courtyard was filled with rows of chairs, and the faces of the graduates glowed with excitement and pride. Among them, Emma Reed adjusted the graduation cap on her head, nervous and emotional. She had made it. Over the past few years, her life had changed in ways she had never imagined possible. After discovering that Nathan was her father, and that Sam finally had a grandfather, the pieces of the life she had always wanted began to fall into place. Nathan's unconditional support had allowed Emma to return to school, something she had abandoned long ago. And now, as she looked at the crowd in front of her, she couldn't hold back tears of happiness. Sam, now a 10-year-old boy, waved excitedly at her from one of the front rows. Next to him, Nathan sat, his eyes fixed on Emma, his heart swelling with pride. He had never thought he would live to see this day, the day when his daughter, the one he believed he had lost forever, finally achieved something so great. To him, this was more than an academic celebration, it was confirmation that their future was secure, that the family he had regained was thriving. When Emma's name was called to the stage, she walked to the podium with determination. The ceremony seemed to pass in slow motion for Nathan, who watched her as if he were seeing his wife, Grace, in a younger version. The resemblance between the two was striking. And though the years of separation could never be erased, Nathan knew they now had the present and the future to build new memories. As she received her diploma, Emma looked out at the crowd, and among the applause, her eyes met Nathan's and Sam's. She wouldn't have made it here without them. That diploma, for her, was more than a piece of paper. It was a symbol of hope, of overcoming, of a future full of promise for her and her son. After the ceremony, Nathan and Sam rushed to meet Emma. Sam, full of energy and pride for his mother, hugged her tightly, and Nathan approached, his eyes brimming with tears. "I knew you could do it," he said, his voice low and full of emotion. Emma smiled at him, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the past begin to lift. They had overcome so much. The man who had raised her had never been a father to her, but now, with Nathan by her side, she had a true father, a man who loved her unconditionally and would do anything for her and for Sam. "We did it, Dad," Emma replied, hugging Nathan tenderly. "We all did." The three of them stood there for a few minutes, enjoying the moment together, as the sun began to set on the horizon. What once seemed like a life of loss and suffering had now transformed into a path of healing and love. In the months that followed, Emma began working in a stable job, something she had never imagined before. With Nathan's help, she was able to secure a future for Sam and herself, and now, for the first time in her life, she felt safe, loved, and with an unshakable support system. Nathan, for his part, had finally found the peace he had sought for decades. He had a daughter. He had a grandson. And he had a purpose again. The house that had once been filled with silence was now full of laughter, conversation, and hope. The loneliness that had accompanied him for so many years had been replaced by the unconditional love of his new family. And so, as the sun set on that evening of celebration, Nathan, Emma, and Sam knew that, despite the scars of the past, they had found their way back to each other. A new life had begun, and this time, they would face the future together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.